Hi, and welcome to my October essay, Right Relationship with Competition. So this month I decided to break from a traditional format and I kind of present two related thoughts side by side. One side of my thoughts is my collected thoughts on competition, and the other is more of an analysis of what we mean when we say right relationship. For the narration, I'm just going to read straight through, which means it might kind of bop back and forth between these two different thoughts a little bit, but I thought that would be the best way to narrate it. So let's begin by asking, what is competition? Competition is a social relationship between individuals or groups in which they engage in a contest for a resource or an accolade which cannot be shared. This is sometimes called a zero-sum game, in which the success of one party means a loss for another. You can compete with past versions of yourself, as in setting a personal record, but the essence of this competitive relationship is the same. Either the past you or the current you ends up with the achievement. Competition as a social relationship creates hierarchy, a social structure in which the winners of various competitions carry some sort of authority or privilege or token of having won. Both competition and hierarchy are natural forms of social organization, and in many environments, they are the default. Competition and hierarchy kind of chicken and egg each other. In environments where neither exists, the emergence of one quickly leads to the emergence of the other. As a social relationship, competition primarily serves as a driver of motivation, especially within hierarchies. The desire to be the best or have the privileges or recognition that accompany a special place in social hierarchy. Even when you're competing against yourself, it is for the purpose of motivation, to be a better you. So what is right relationship? First, I want to acknowledge that, quote, right relationship, end quote, is a term that bounces around movement, spiritual, activist, and coaching spaces. And the term has its own specific history, regardless of whatever connotations we put with it now. For a fascinating look into the history of this term and a great take on what right relationship even means, there's a great article by Katie Churchman, which I've linked in the text. There are only two words in right relationship, so I want to take a look at both of them. Right, in this case, is a signifier of type, correctly implying that relationships between people or objects or ideas come in types, and that one of the axes of type that we use to describe a relationship can be right and wrong. Personally, I'm pretty sensitive to terms or words that mean different things to different people at different times or contexts, but serve the purpose of communicating a set of values or cultural positioning. By using the term, quote, right relationship, I'm not only describing a type of relationship, I am also positioning myself as a certain type of person from a certain type of background who uses these words in a certain type of way. I think it's important to recognize that this term, right relationship, carries some baggage and some connotations other than its simple meaning, and I'm going to try to unpack those as well. Let's take an example with teaching. One person might describe their relationship with their coach as, quote, right relationship because it provides guidance, support, and constructive challenges. For another person, the same actions might feel overly controlling or restrictive, not fostering of the autonomy they need. The term right in this context is subjective and shaped by individual expectations, needs, and goals. It's not the actions themselves that define the relationship as right, but rather how those actions align with the evolving needs of the individuals. What's considered right for one person could feel entirely wrong for someone else, even when the action is exactly the same. We see then that right and wrong don't have specific meanings of their own. They suggest that any right action shares some characteristic with any other right action, even when the action themselves might be totally different. Right becomes a floating signifier, malleable and context-dependent, standing in for more specific words like productive, supportive, or any other word depending on the goal of the relationship. The only fixed meaning is the thing that we want. Wrong relationship is implied, where the wrong is a stand-in for other more specific words like off-goal or reactive or unintentional or instinctive rather than considered, or that wrong relationship is a different type of person who carries a different set of connotations or thinks about their life in a different sort of way. Let's come back to thinking about hierarchy. Is hierarchy bad necessarily? The idea of stable, uncontested hierarchy is the default social structure that I've encountered most often. Hierarchy is at its most appealing when it's stable. So much of that maintaining the stability of the hierarchy takes precedence over the needs of individuals or communities who are maybe ranked lower in the hierarchy. The desire to maintain smooth sailing and maintain the status quo can be weaponized by people in power or those who support the hierarchy in order to prevent conflict or change. It's important to recognize that this tactic of weaponizing the change as some sort of like breaking of the status quo or breaking of the smooth sailing is in fact a competitive tactic. It follows that even when a hierarchy appears stable, it only remains stable because the hierarchy itself is winning the competition against both the underclass of its own hierarchy and the meta competition against other forms of organization. For this essay, it's enough to say that competition and hierarchy emerge unprompted from certain social and environmental conditions, but that they're not unique in that characteristic, because other forms of social organization also emerge unprompted given certain social and environmental conditions. Since this is the case, if we're interested in competition as a phenomena that relates to movement and movement teaching, it's important to acknowledge that competition is neither more natural nor superior to other forms of motivation, and that hierarchy is the form of social structure which relates specifically to competition. So if we have right relationship, what is wrong relationship? If I'm especially sensitive to right and wrong, and would rather replace them with more specific words that mean something more specific, why have I used the term right relationship for this essay? Part of it is because I want to hold a moment of tension around the idea of wrong relationship. Isn't an instinctive reaction just another word for an intuitive reaction? Isn't the idea that we should regulate our reactions sometimes a social construct designed to maintain obedience and status quo? There's a great piece called A Non-Ideal Theory for Sexual Consent, where the writer, Professor Kukla, gets into some really good, muddy concepts on the concept of right relationship being consensual, and how these terms lose a lot of their utility when we use them to try and describe actual relationships in the real world between other people or ourselves. The idea of consent is an important one when we're thinking about movement or sport or competition. For example, the gymnastics code of points is an interesting example, as Dr. Dave Tilley writes at length about the science behind knee and leg injuries and the way in which the code of points is not adapted to current research and actually encourages gymnasts to land in a way that's riskier than a way that would score them less points. This leaves athletes and coaches in a conundrum. Do they land in positions which award more points but carry higher injury risk, or land safely at the expense of points in competition? When we're talking about younger athletes who may not fully understand the implications, what are our moral or ethical obligations around their consent to participate in competition or their consent to land in one way or another? How does the competition, or the rules of the competition in this case, encourage us to be in wrong relationship with ourselves or with our athletes? That said, if someone wants to win the competition, for example, to get a scholarship to go to college, how do we respect their decision or not? Are the terms right relationship and wrong relationship useful to us at all anymore in this context? I'm going to bounce back to competition and think about competition as a motivational tool or as a motivator. As competition relates to movement teaching, we can pretty firmly place it in the camp of motivation. Whether we're in right relationship with competition is almost entirely an examination of our relationship with the ways in which competition is motivating us, whether those motivations are moving us towards our goals, and the extent to which we maintain healthy levels of autonomy and self-image. The cost-benefit analysis of the effect of the competition on these things. I was talking with another movement educator the other day. She works in cheerleading and acrobatics in public and charter schools, and we were discussing the moment of buy-in from teenagers in particular, and the role that an event plays in their motivation. The way their spirits seek a rite of passage or a rite of initiation, or any of the rituals that modern society is telling them about in movies and TV, but keeping them away from in their real life. There's this void for them that competition in team sports or cheerleading fills, because it creates an event which gives meaning to their practice. In the research behind Amanda Visick's fun maps, she had students who were involved in youth sports write down what made sports fun. she ended up with 81 fun attributes. She had the students then individually, each student on their own, sort those attributes into categories and then rate each of the 81 attributes for frequency, how often it occurred, importance, how important it was to them, and how feasible it was to institute that thing of fun. She then used the sorting and rating to create a cluster map of the 11 groups and their relative importance. If you want to see some of her fun maps, you can click on the link in the text. When we look at her fun maps, the event, which is the game, looms large. Getting to and from the game, working towards a game, the moments in a game where you have a great play. We see this in some of the categories that the students created, like trying hard, going to games, game time support, team rituals. These are the things that students thought was really fun about the team sports that they were participating in. Practice times seem just as important as the games, making it clear that having good games doesn't make up for having bad practices, but we still see the centering of the game in their experience. I can't help but feel that these fun maps that she made are a little bit idealized, but it's still really useful to notice the role that the event plays in them. My takeaway is that the event, the show, the competition, the performance, whatever it is inherently enjoyable. We like a little bit of pressure, whether it's with ourselves or with others. We like a hill to climb, a mountain to conquer, a chance to test ourselves against the wider world and see where we stand. But what happens then when the answer to the question, where do I stand in the wider world, is at the bottom of some hierarchy? Let's unpack these competitive relationships a little bit. So we've unpacked the word right, and now I want to pull out a different lens and unpack the word relationship. In this case, the relationships I'm interested in are competitive ones. The relationships we form with other people, with movement, with ourselves. These relationships exist in the micro, the self-talk we use with ourselves, or the small gestures of competition or hierarchy that occur within a movement class. And they occur in the macro, whether we compete in competitions or compete for performance jobs. I'm curious about how those relationships exist inside larger systems. I want to play with the idea that competition is a mode of relating rather than an event in itself. What happens if instead of saying, this is a competition, using the word as a noun, we say, we are competing. The way we relate is through competition. I love this quote from Stafford Beer, the purpose of a system is what it does. In this case, the quote is pointing us towards examining the material utility of a relationship in order to determine its purpose. We can leave aside the stated purpose of a competition and look instead at what competition does and whether or not those results are tallying with what we want. Have you ever engaged in a conversation that veers towards one-upsmanship? Have you ever felt the subtle social pressure to engage with people in this way and the effect that this competitive mode of relationship has on a friendship or a romance? I have definitely done this. I think it's a pretty inevitable human process. But staying in right relationship with my own competitive tendencies means giving attention and intention to them. It's so hard for me to separate right from intentional. The idea of examination, the idea that examination is inherently better than non-examination is pretty deep inside me, which makes me want to unpack it. Intention and attention basically mean the same thing for me. They both refer to different moments in a cycle of examination. Attending to something allows me to be intentional about how I relate to it. And intending to do something requires that I give my attention to it. Attention and intention are actually not required for most actions. They imply a level of heightened awareness, of heightened choice. When I talk about Amanda Fissick's research on fun in youth sports, I would love to see her use that same methodology in reverse, as I think it would help to clarify what right relationship means and what it feels like. That same research in reverse would be like, what isn't fun about sports, right? How do we create the wrong relationships in competition? Does right relationship always feel like flow or like challenge, or an interplay between success and failure and socialization? At the end of the day, is right relationship just all about doing all things in moderation? I'm reminded of the movie Little Miss Sunshine. If you have not seen it, you absolutely have to see it, because it brings right relationship with competition into some poignant detail in ways that I'm really tensioned with. As a quick summary, Olive, who's this like 9, maybe 10-year-old young girl, enters a beauty pageant, a California beauty pageant, while her family and her are like totally naive to the culture of beauty pageants and the preparation that goes into them. Lots of other things are going on in the family, but the point that's central to this essay is what happens towards the end of the movie when Olive arrives at the competition. All the other girls are like fully made up, fully costumed, fully rehearsed with full show numbers, and poor little Olive is just wildly unprepared. She starts performing and everyone kind of starts snickering at her, and she ends up being joined on stage by her whole supportive family, who then essentially give a middle finger to the whole competition and end up getting banned from competing ever again. The movie isn't just a takedown of beauty pageant culture. It's also like a heartwarming encouragement to flip off the establishment and just let Olive be Olive. I would love to see the sequel to this movie that like plays out what happens to Olive through her teenagehood. For this essay, my purpose here is that the event of this beauty pageant, the event that Olive wants to compete in, sets the stage for the processing of various family traumas and relationships. The pageant centers the course of the whole family's life for a time. It gives them meaning. And while they don't participate in the competition on its own terms, it certainly serves a really important purpose in their lives. It's clear that the movie's point of view on the competition itself is, fuck what other people say, compete on your own field and in your own terms. You'd think that I would agree with this point of view, but I find myself hesitating. What does this say? What does this point of view say about all the other people who are competing in this beauty pageant? The ones who have fully invested and fully centered their lives around this competition and this culture. The movie is pretty unsparing in its treatment of people who commit to and invest in beauty pageants and competitions. And maybe it's this unsparing and unnuanced treatment that makes me hesitate. Our relationship with competition is often deeply polarized. You're either for competition, dividing the world into winners and losers, or you're against competition and wholly reject the artificial rules and the recognizing of winners and losers. Neither of these polarized positions strikes me as right relationship. So where do I end up here? One of the things I've changed my stance on is that right relationship with competition can't mean total avoidance of competition. I think too many of us who don't like competition shy away from it too hard, and it makes us a bit cotton-bally, a bit too lax, a bit too afraid of standards or tests or trials, or recognizing the really good things about competition. Right relationship also can't mean a total commitment to competition, though. This makes the string of the relationship too tense, too prone to breaking. Maybe the key here is in constant attention and engagement to the unfolding process of whatever competition is meaning in that moment. When it comes to competition, attending to different competitive relationships, the relationship I have with myself, the relationship I have to my movement, the relationship I have to other people, the relationship I have to other teams, maybe monitoring the social and psychological risks that we're taking, the volume of the competition, and whether the whole system that we're engaging in feels right to us. Maybe this is the important thing. Maybe right relationship is like tuning an instrument, not too tight, not too loose, striking just the right note. As nice as it would be to tie this essay up with that cute little bow, I wonder to myself, is wrong relationship even something that's really possible? Or are we inevitably in relationship with competition, whether we want to be or not, and left to navigate that relationship however each of us thinks best?